Today we're going to talk about state constitutions and their place both within the state governmental system and how they describe local governments, but also within the federal system as well. And it's very important to understand that when we talk about state constitutions, they're really an important aspect of the preservation of our rights in addition to the structure of government that we see at the state level. So the founders in instituting federalism in the United States, we're really looking for a way in which people could have recourse to multiple governments in order to protect their rights. So as American citizens, and we don't often think about this, but it is very important, as American citizens, we're almost like dual citizens in the fact that we have recourse to the federal government and the federal constitution and the rights enshrined there, and we can use the federal court system when appropriate. But we also, at the same time, have recourse to our state constitutions and the state court systems and the rights that are protected under the state constitutions for us as well. So that means that we can try different avenues if we feel that for whatever reason our rights have been violated. And I'll give an example of that in a couple of minutes. Now, in thinking about this, I'd like to give an overview of a couple of different things. One is, what are the components of state constitutions? Second of all, what are some of the controversies that have been enshrined in constitutions over time? And we do see some patterns throughout American history. And then also, how do we change these constitutions, both informally and formally? So that's kind of an overview of what we're going to take a look at here in looking at states' constitutions. Let me just bring up some PowerPoint slides here and we'll get started. So basically, when we're looking at state constitutions, what we see is that state constitutions are much longer than the federal constitution. So if you look at the US Constitution, it's about 8,700 words. The average US state constitution is about 36,000 words. So, you're looking at almost 6 times as much of words that are in state constitutions. Alabama has the longest at 340,000 words, and Pennsylvania is a little bit smaller than normal, a little bit more than 3 times the U.S. Constitution at about 27,700 words. Now, one of the reasons why they have more words in them than does the National Constitution is because they do explicitly cover a number of public policy areas that we'll talk about, including taxes, finance, and education, which aren't covered in the US Constitution, which is just a bare bones kind of functioning document. And at the same time, it also deals with local governments because local governments are creatures of the state, and the provisions for local government and local government taxation and various other powers are kind of sketched out within a state constitution and then flushed out a little bit more in the code of each state. So we see that these are much longer. Now, let's take a look at the very first kind of aspect of state constitutions, and that is, unlike the U.S. Constitution, what we see is that the constitutions at the state level are always start out with a Declaration of Rights. So I'm going to bring up here our Declaration of Rights. This is the most recent constitution in Pennsylvania. University of Pittsburgh does a nice job of laying out all the constitutions that we've had. If you're interested in taking a look at them, the website's here. So we have at the beginning of our state constitutions typically some sort of Declaration of Rights. Now, if you remember, we don't have a Declaration of Rights at the beginning of the U.S. Constitution. That was something that could not be agreed upon, or the utility of couldn't be agreed upon at the Constitutional Convention. So we actually didn't get our, what we call the Bill of Rights added to the Constitution until 1789. But all state constitutions really start out here with these Declaration of Rights. So, they're a little more flowery than we would see in the U.S. Constitution. But a couple of things to point out here are, that are a little bit different. Each state constitution adds, in many respects, more flowery language or more specific language than we probably see in the U.S. Constitution. So let me give you an example here for the religious freedom. So this is Section 3 of our Pennsylvania Constitution. All men have a natural and indefeasible right to worship Almighty God according to the dictates of their own consciences. Now, that's more or less what we would see in the US Constitution, the freedom of religion. But they go a little bit farther, which is very interesting. And this is kind of part and parcel of the Quaker heritage, or from William Penn and the legacy of that. We also see no man can of right be compelled to attend, erect, or support any place of worship. So we have not only the right to practice our religion as we want, but the right to not practice, if that in and of itself is something that's important to us. And that's laid out here again in section 4. No person who acknowledges the being of God and the future state of rewards and punishments shall, on account of his religious sentiments, be disqualified to hold any office. So again, no religious qualification, but also it can't be held against you. So that's very important. Now, I mentioned that we can use our different rights within our state constitutions in an effort to be able to preserve our rights even when the federal constitution doesn't preserve them. Just want to highlight a very important section here, section 5 on elections. It says, elections shall be free and equal, and no power, civil or military, shall at any time interfere to prevent the free exercise of the right of suffrage. Now, we saw a couple years ago in the case in which Pennsylvania was severely gerrymandered after the 2010 census, and some really bizarre looking redistricting that went on. And basically the Supreme Court of the United States didn't want to get involved in it. They consider redistricting to be what they call a political thicket. It's just much too political, and by its very nature, it's a political process, and the U.S. Supreme Court did not want to get involved. However, a suit was filed with the Pennsylvania Supreme Court arguing that the Pennsylvania Constitution was violated because of the gerrymandering of the districts within the U.S. House contingency here in Pennsylvania. And specifically, when the Supreme Court decided that case and said that we had to redraw the boundaries in 2018, they explicitly cited this right within the Pennsylvania Constitution, that elections shall be free and equal. And they made the argument that the way that districts were gerrymandering did not make things equal, and that they were basically, the districts were drawn in order to be able to ensure that one political party would be the victor over the other. Therefore, it violated the Pennsylvania Constitution. There's an example in which the state constitution actually did something that the national constitution did not. We see a lot of the same things, freedom of the press, searches and seizures, criminal prosecution. There are some things that are written into our bill, our Declaration of Rights, that are in the text of the U.S. Constitution instead of the Bill of Rights. So, the writ of habeas corpus and no ex post facto laws are all things that are written into the text of the U.S. Constitution as opposed to being a specific right. And let me just flip down here. Sometimes when people take a look at the Second Amendment of the Constitution, they see a little bit of a line that's blurry. There's nothing that's blurry about the Pennsylvania right to bear arms. The right of the citizens to bear arms in defense of themselves and the state shall not be questioned. All right, so that's pretty adamant, right? So we have a couple of other things. We do have a right to natural resources within our state constitution. And unlike the federal government and in the Federal Bill of Rights, we have a Equal Rights Amendment added to our Constitution, which was added in the early 1970s. Right? So those are the fundamental kind of rights that we see within the context of the Pennsylvania State Constitution. Now, beyond that, what we see is that there are a number of other components to the state constitutions. And let's take a look at them. Actually, let me just give you a couple of other declarations of rights here. Here's a pretty strident, New Hampshire, live free or die, there are a different breed of people up there. They have the right to a revolution within the context of their constitution. So government being instituted for the common benefit, protection, and security of the whole community, and not for the private interest or emolument, or benefit, financial benefit, of any one man, family, or class of men, Therefore, whenever the ends of government are perverted and public liberty manifestly endangered, and all other means of redress are ineffectual, the people may, and of right ought, to reform the old or establish a new government. The doctrine of non-resistance against arbitrary power and oppression is absurd, slavish, and destructive of the good and happiness of mankind. All right, so that goes, you look at the Declaration of Independence, some of that language is used there, but that last sentence, the doctrine of non-resistance, is absurd, slavish, and destructive. So that's, pretty strident language from our friends up there in New Hampshire. And, the same way that we have a pretty strong version of the right to bear arms, their version, New Hampshire, says all persons have the right to keep and bear arms in defense of themselves, their families, their property, and the state. Now, there are some provisions of constitutions within declarations of rights which are manifestations of the individual histories of the state, or else something about their economy or their cultures. So let's give you a couple of them. Mississippi has a clause in their Declaration of Rights that says, the right to withdraw from the federal union on account of any real or supposed grievance shall never be assumed by this state, nor shall any law be passed in derogation of the paramount allegiance of the citizens of the state to the government of the United States. All right, so given the history of them joining the Confederacy, what we see is that they have a clause that says that they can't withdraw from the Union. Wyoming, out west, particularly in these dry states, arid states with a lot of deserts and high plains, there isn't a lot of water. So there's actually a codicil in the Declaration of Rights in Wyoming about water control. Water being essential to the industrial prosperity of limited amount and easy of diversion from its natural channels, its control must be in the state, which in providing for its use shall equally guard all the various interests involved, right? So that gives us kind of an idea, again, of what different states may be. And then there are some things that are also kind of strange. So in Texas, you can't commit people of unsound mind without just due process. That's included in their Declaration of Rights. And Nevada, because the large amount of the state of Nevada that's actually owned by the federal government, there's a clause in their Declaration of Rights that talks about the idea that the Nevadan people give up the rights to that federal territory and they can't take that back. So that's written in their Declaration of Rights. Now, in addition to that, what we see is that there are a number of components of state constitutions that really kind of lay out the bare bones aspects of the institutions within the context of the state politics. So, all state governments have some form of separation of powers where they have a legislative branch, executive branch, judicial branch, civil service rules. So those are all kind of written in here. Most states have more statewide elected officials. We only have the president and the vice president at the federal level. So in Pennsylvania, in addition to the governor and lieutenant governor, we also elect an auditor general, an attorney general, and a treasurer. And all the provisions about those jobs are also laid out here within the context of the separation of powers arguments. There's also sections more that draw explicit kind of understandings of the way that the elections will happen within a state. And remember that is, for the most part, not part of the U.S. Constitution, because the U.S. Constitution, other than regulating the time and manner of elections, punts really down to the state level to decide who actually can vote, and also when and how elections are going to be handled. So much more detail in Pennsylvania and in state constitutions. In addition to that, most states have some form of policy discussions within the context of their state constitution. So, there's something about finances, what types of taxes are allowable, what types of taxes may not be allowable. So in Pennsylvania, we have the explicit decision that you cannot have a progressive income tax, that all taxes have to apply to people equally. That's written in our state constitution. We also, since education is something that's dealt with by state and local governments, not the federal government, usually some provisions for public education, and then discussions about constitutional revision. Now, the last thing that we see within the component of a state constitution is the provisions related to local government and how local government can operate within an individual state. Local governments, under a concept called Dillon's Rule, basically do not have any rights unless given to them by the state. So the forms of governments that are allowable for local government, whether or not they're going to be a commission form of government or mayor and strong mayor form of government, whatever it might be, they're all kind of decided by the states, enshrined in the Constitution, and also discussions of various taxation policies that they might have. So those are the basic overviews of the components of state constitutions. Now, how do you get constitutional change, right? I mean, we've seen that we have 5 constitutions in Pennsylvania history. We haven't had anything since 1968, so, we're going on here 52 years since we've had a new constitution. There's a couple ways you can get changes without just throwing out the whole constitution wholesale and starting over again. One is informal change. So every time the state court systems interpret a case and use that to interpret the Constitution, they're adding some context or some larger value to that. So the judiciary fills in a lot of the holes about what the Constitution means. Both the legislature and the executive also do that on a regular basis as they interpret their powers under the Constitution. So whenever legislation is being drawn up by the state legislature, or whenever an action is being taken by the executive branch, lawyers look into the constitutional principles behind that and whether it's allowable. And sometimes they extend those powers a little bit, or they curb their powers depending on what they see. So just the operation of daily government can sometimes stretch or help to define what constitutional provisions mean. We also have 4 different ways in which people can change their constitutions by giving it either amendments or throwing it out wholesale and starting over again. The first is through a legislative proposal, in which usually the way this happens is that the legislature votes on something and then it goes to the people for ratification. So we have a form of that in Pennsylvania. It's a complicated form. Basically, state legislature, both houses of state legislature have to pass a constitutional amendment, and then there has to be an election. So if we don't like what's done, we can kick all those people out. And after that election, they have to vote again a second time. And if it passes a second time, then it goes to what we would call a referendum for the people. And then we get to vote on that. And if 50% plus 1 say that we should have this as a new constitutional amendment, our Constitution is then amended, right? So it's a very complicated process in Pennsylvania, but it's used far more often than you would see at the national level. In some states that have direct democracy, popular initiatives allows individuals to be able to gather enough signatures to put a constitutional change on the ballot, and then people vote on that. And if a majority plus 1 or a majority says yes, then that becomes part of the Constitution. Some states, New York's one of these, every several decades, their Constitution calls for there to be a vote on whether or not people want to have a constitutional convention. And they can vote that up or down. And if they do, then you have to have a constitutional convention where they take up, revising the state constitution. And in some cases, constitutional commissions can be called upon to be able to assess the value of the Constitution, state constitutions, and provide possible revisions for those constitutions. So if we take a look at U.S. history, there's a couple of kind of major contextual issues that occur within the context of constitutional history. One is the interstate distribution of power, and the second is the scope of government, how big government's going to be, and who's going to have powers. Right? So by interstate distribution of power, what we mean essentially is what areas of the state are going to have power, and who's going to have the power to be able to vote and to participate in government, and how are those divisions manifested. So what we saw prior to what we call the redistricting cases in the early 1960s was that states were not reapportioned every 10 years as they should have been under the U.S. constitutions. And in essence, rural people held a lot more seats in their state legislatures and Congress than they should have otherwise, because the urban areas had been growing. So we saw a series of Supreme Courts that called upon for reapportionment to make sure that every district basically has the same amount of people, and that redistributed power throughout the state. Talk a little bit about this Constitution of 1776, which is always on the top of people's minds. In Pennsylvania, there have been long-standing grievances that the Penn family basically ignored most of the rest of the state and consolidated most power within what were then the only three counties in the southeastern part of Pennsylvania: Philadelphia, Bucks, and Chester. There were no Delaware or Montgomery County at that point in time. And basically they had an outsized influence over Pennsylvania government prior to the Constitution of 1776. In the Constitution of 1776, all the representation was on the basis of tax-paying citizens. So as a consequence of that, those areas of Western Pennsylvania now got representation proportionate to what they should have. So these kind of things go on, throughout, state constitutional history. Second thing that we really see is this idea of political participation. Each constitution kind of, in many respects, opens up the types of people that are able to vote within our system. So, in many cases, there were in early state constitutions religious qualifications, property qualifications, and gradually what we saw as we moved into the 1800s was constitutions changed where almost every free white male was able to vote. And we see that kind of going on. One big thing was we did in our Constitution of 1838 actually had the disenfranchisements of African-American men. And only one word was changed in the Constitution, but it changed from all men who pay taxes are able to vote to all white men. And that, in effect, disenfranchised African-American men from being able to vote. We're not the only state that did that. But it wasn't until we got to the Constitution later on in the 1800s, particularly after the Civil War, that African-American got the right to vote back again. We weren't very progressive when it came to women either. It actually took the 20th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution for Pennsylvania to give women the right to vote. There was a constitutional referendum in the early 1900s, which failed to give women the right to vote. And, you might say to yourself, well, why would that happen? Well, if females couldn't vote, it was only the males that could vote. And a sizable proportion said no. So that's the way that happened. The scope of government also is important. We see over the course of American history a real kind of ebb and flow of power between the legislature and the governor. So if you take a look at our first Constitution of 1776 in Pennsylvania, what you see is that there was actually no real executive branch. There was a council of 13 governors, which basically acted on behalf of the legislature when the legislature was not in session. So we didn't even have a governor at that point in time, or we had a governor, but it was in name only. Gradually, thinking about the experiences of the revolution wearing off, we started to realize that you really need to have a more powerful governor. And what you saw was that, later constitutions like our Constitution of 1790 created the office of governor. And then it went back and forth over the 1800s between powers between the governor and the legislature. Governors would become a bit corrupt and the legislature would get more power. The legislature would become corrupt and the governors would get more power. And then finally, as we got into the 1900s and 20th century, we saw that governors were given more power to control their states in the constitutions. The other thing is direct popular government or direct democracy. From that perspective, some states have adopted direct democracy. where they are able to actually vote on legislation. That, for the most part, was a big issue back in the early 1900s during the progressive movement, where people wanted to take power away from machine politicians and corrupt politicians and give it to the people. In addition to that, we also saw the rise of term limits within states really in the 1990s as a way to get career politicians out of the business of being in the state legislature and have more turnover, under the guise that we should have more citizen representatives. So, this is just a brief overview of constitutional history and some of the concepts behind it, but it gives a good idea of how important state constitutions are to our daily life, and also how important federalism is to our lives, because we have recourse to both of these governments.